That's basically the metaphysical position that all of that exists is the physical world. And therefore, if we can fully understand everything that governs the interactions of the particles that make up that world, then we can understand all of causality and all of the nature of our unfolding reality. In fact, that materialist science that I worshiped before my coma, and I do not use that term lightly, would scoff at you for claiming to have free will, because that science claimed that it was all just chemical reactions, electron fluxes, and the substance of the brain. It gave us an illusion of free will, an illusion of conscious awareness, but that ultimately it was all predetermined by the laws of physics, chemistry, biology. And that was the hardcore position, but that's really where you went if you believed that conventional scientific training, which basically said our existence is birth to death and nothing more. When our physical brain and body die, that's the end of conscious awareness. My journey back in 2008 showed me that just the opposite is true. We are conscious in spite of our brain. And that's really where I think all of this gets a lot more exciting. And the proof to me was very solid in the form of the severe case of bacterial meningoencephalitis. You couldn't have come up with a better laboratory prep to try and mimic human death than what I went through. This kind of severe meningitis is a perfect model for human death because it selectively destroys the neocortex and then the brainstem, the pieces of the brain that are most responsible, according to modern neuroscience, for our detailed human conscious awareness. And yet, the medical details of my case made it crystal clear that brain was in no shape to harbor any kind of dream or hallucination. And that's something that I discuss in the book Proof of Heaven, but that point is greatly amplified by the medical case report written by 3 doctors not involved in my care that came out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in September of 2018. Dr. Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson were fascinated by my recovery, and that's why they wrote this case report. And in fact, when they were challenged by the peer review editors of that journal, how do you explain this? This is unprecedented in the medical literature to have somebody this ill from a weak and deep coma from gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis with all the lab parameters, Glasgow Coma Scale 6 or 7, when anything below 9 is deep coma, and all the lab values. That's what haunted me, was when I was reviewing my own medical records and remembering everything that I went through. That brain was in no position to construct any such elaborate hallucination or dream. That's why the scientific community takes my story so incredibly seriously. And that's why some people who try to take me down with ad hominem attacks cling desperately to their hope that their claim that this was a medically induced coma. They are denying the facts of the case that are absolutely a beautiful gift to humanity. And that is, no, this extraordinary experience happened, but wasn't caused by my brain at all. The fact of the matter was I was so close to death and so far gone from this world that I could experience this extraordinary spiritual journey that I had. And that's really, to me, the magic of it all. And I can dive briefly into what all that involved, and then we can talk about some of the details and why it's important to the scientific community and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's, especially for people that haven't read your book or anything, I think it'd be good to understand what actually led to the meningitis and then what happened once you were in the hospital and things started to go south.
We never ever determined a cause, why I had an E. coli bacterial meningoencephalitis. That was never discovered. It turns out, important to point out, in my journey, I had a very atypical feature for near-death experiences, and that is a pretty complete amnesia for the life of Eben Alexander. I had no memories of the personal events in my life, none of my religious teachings, none of my scientific knowledge of cosmology, physics, neuroscience, quantum physics, etc. None of that made it in. I had an empty slate. And in looking back on it, I've come to realize that every near-death experience is tailored for the individual who has it. That's ultimately the reason these things occur. But there are NDEs that are so remarkable that it's of great interest to this world at large. In fact, I think all the NDEs can be very instructive to this world at large because they paint a beautiful picture that we're all in this together and that the binding force of love is absolutely there, connecting us with each other and with the universe at large. So my beliefs before coma were really strongly that of that materialist scientist that brain creates consciousness. And then, of course, fearing that when the brain and body die, awareness comes to an end. The opposite is what I experienced. And it all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. It was like being in dirty jello. It seemed to go on for a very long time, even though I'm sure I didn't have a memory of moment to moment. Eternity would seem like a reasonable length of time that I experienced all that, but I was rescued, luckily, by this slowly spinning white light that came towards me, and it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view, as I called that initial stage, and it led me up through this light portal into this brilliant ultra-real gateway valley. And that's the part that's so hard to explain to people. It was much more real than this world, much more detailed, much more memorable, much more meaningful, much more transformational. This was an extraordinarily rich environment in which I found myself that makes this world look very murky and dreamlike by comparison. Now, that Gateway Valley, it had a lot of Earth-like features. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in these vast formations. And down below in this verdant, fertile meadow, there were thousands of beings dancing, lots of joy and merriment. I remember children playing, dogs jumping, incredible festivities. And it was all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. And the best thing about the whole scene I'm describing to you is I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful woman sitting beside me on this butterfly wing, and she looked at me with a look of pure love, sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, high forehead, broad smile. She was dressed in the same kind of simple garb of all the beings dancing down below, but it was very colorful, really colors beyond the rainbow. And when I say this world is ultra real, do understand this is the realm where people would have life reviews, where your life would flash before your eyes and you would relive the events, not just a remembering. And also those events in a life review are commonly described as being from the perspective of others around us who were impacted by our actions and even our thoughts. In other words, your life review is a beautiful example of how we're all in this together. And if you hurt another, you're hurting yourself. If you hand out a lot of pain and suffering in the life review, you have to be on the receiving end of that to see what it felt like. And the life review is there to serve as a course correction, because another major part of the scientific evidence for the reality of this broader concept of mind we're talking about is the scientific evidence for reincarnation. And the University of Virginia, which is about 12 miles from where I'm sitting right now, for the last 6 decades, they've studied more than 2,700 cases of past life memories in children indicative of reincarnation, of which 1,700 of the cases were solved. That is, they found the person who was described by the child. So this much bigger vision of consciousness is one that is here in the scientific community and certainly in my very neighborhood. Now, I was discovering this for my own on this extraordinary journey. And this beautiful message that came to me from this lovely spiritual guide, the guardian angel on the butterfly wing, was you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. And I cannot tell you how reassuring and validating that was in that moment. And it was around that time that I witnessed this soft summer breeze that blew through. And that breeze essentially changed everything, because given my complete amnesia and complete lack of knowledge or any kind of history of connection with human thought, that summer breeze was my first awareness of that infinitely loving God force. And I came back from this incredible journey realizing that it doesn't matter if you want to call that deity God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, whatever the words are. The truth of the matter is that more than 90% of near-death experiencers from all different faith traditions, and many who were previously agnostic or atheistic, more than 90% of near-death experiencers through thousands of years come back believing in an infinitely powerful, loving force at the core of the universe. So the reality of that presence defies the fact that we can't necessarily nail it down with a proper label. That's why it's so important to have your own practice of centering prayer, going within, meditation, what have you, to develop your own personal relationship with that loving force. Now, for me on this journey, it turns out that those angelic choirs provided yet another portal to a higher and higher level. And what I remember is that all of four-dimensional space-time, the kind of lowest material realm, collapsed down. And then this entire spiritual region, this gateway valley, as I called it, that same realm where you can experience birth, death, everything in between, you have left time. You are no longer just remembering events that occurred in a lifetime, in Earth time. You're reliving those events. That's the power of that realm. But given my amnesia, I was not to have an Eben Alexander life review. I had life reviews presented to me in two very powerful fashions in the next stages of this journey. Because with these angelic choirs providing yet another portal, all of that deep time, as I call it, or meta time, that's the causal relationship that occurs in that spiritual realm, which is of complete order of magnitude beyond what we experience here, because you can have all the events of your life simultaneously presented in that deep time. Very important concept, because this explains a lot about how reincarnation and all that can still honor that our loved ones will absolutely be there when we pass over to help welcome us into that realm. And people are often concerned when they hear all this evidence for reincarnation. Oh no, what if they've reincarnated before I get there? No, I can tell you from my experience, that just doesn't happen. That's the importance of understanding this different temporal layer in that mystical spiritual realm. But what that led me up into was what I call the core. And I remember seeing all of even that spiritual realm collapsing down until what I saw was this complex oversphere that was there for teaching.